Just when you thought they couldn't sink any lower, they completely left Clark off their list of the top 5 greatest women's college basketball players of all time. Only stride against Caitlin Clark is that she has not won a national championship, and that is the only thing that you can put against her. Caitlin Clark took Iowa to back-to-back national championship game, and their excuse? She doesn't have a championship. Really? The same network that ranks male players as legends regardless of their title count suddenly decides championships are the only thing that matters when it comes to Caitlin Clark. But I do find it interesting that they do tout off all of her accomplishments, records that have not been broken by anybody else, and they still cannot consider her in the top 5 best categories. We're not falling for their hypocrisy. In this video, we're breaking down exactly how ESPN is actively diminishing Clark's legacy, playing favorites, and rewriting history to fit their agenda. Stay tuned as we expose their double standards one by one. I just don't understand how you can see someone doing more with less in some aspects, but in this one, you can't see it. You can't give them credit for that. ESPN's bias was on full display when they conveniently erased Caitlin Clark from their all-time top 5 list for women's college basketball. Their reasoning? No championship ring. But here's the issue. This rule has never applied to any other players in their rankings. They've honored countless male and female players who never won a title. Yet suddenly, with Caitlin Clark, championships are the only thing that matters. Clark is being used as like a ploy. They gotta put Caitlin Clark's name in the title. They gotta make sure, you think you're watching something about Caitlin Clark, and then the rug is kind of pulled out when it's actually like, nah, she's not even in the top 5. Take Oscar Robertson and Pete Maravich, 2 of the most celebrated college players in history. Neither of them ever won a national championship, yet ESPN had no issue ranking them among the greatest of all time. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark didn't just break records. She rewrote the history books while carrying her team to back-to-back national championship games. If that's your number one criterion, if you don't win a championship, you can't be on any list, fine. She made the point that Caitlin has exploded the game bigger than anybody else. That's part of the significance, and I guess you could say the greatness. The hypocrisy is staggering. If championships were the ultimate requirement, then why was the great Larry Bird, another college basketball icon without a title, ranked so highly on their lists? The truth is obvious. ESPN is holding Caitlin Clark to an entirely different standard, and it gets worse. The way ESPN pulled this off wasn't just disrespectful, it was downright manipulative. They used Clark's name and face to promote the segment, knowing full well that she's the biggest name in women's basketball. Ranking players based on having a ring, a bit of an unfair way just to rank a player's potential. They baited viewers into thinking Clark would be honored alongside the greats, only to completely erase her from the list during the discussion. This wasn't just a debate, it was a calculated move to cash in on her popularity while refusing to acknowledge her impact. ESPN is happy to exploit Clark's success for views, but when it's time to give her the respect she's earned, they suddenly change the criteria. Their own analysts even admitted on air that leaving Clark off felt wrong, acknowledging that she has dominated women's basketball in a way few have before. But instead of standing by the truth, they stuck to their tired argument, one that conveniently ignores how other great players without rings have been treated. ESPN is blatantly shifting the goalpost to downplay Caitlin Clark's greatness. They refuse to recognize her influence, even though she has done more for women's basketball than anyone in recent memory. Whenever anybody says, oh, she didn't win a championship, how do they respond back when you say, who else was on her team? What about getting Iowa to the championship in back-to-back years? Is that not impressive? But why? If championships were the only thing that defined greatness, then why do individual awards exist? Basketball is a team sport. No single player wins a title alone. Clark didn't just dominate at Iowa. She shattered records, elevated the entire game, and took a team with no championship pedigree to back-to-back national title appearances. That alone should put her in the top 5, if not at number 1. ESPN conveniently ignored her unmatched individual stats, so let's talk about the numbers they don't want you to see. Caitlin Clark holds the all-time scoring record in both men's and women's college basketball. That alone cements her as one of the greatest players ever. But her impact extends far beyond scoring. She was also a dominant playmaker, consistently leading in assists and elevating the performance of everyone around her. Simply put, she didn't just rack up points, she made her entire team better. Brianna Stewart won a lot of championships, no question. Did she squad up with a bunch of future WNBA players? Obviously, her accolades speak for themselves. She's a 2-time AP Player of the Year, a 3-time All-American, a 2-time Naismith Player of the Year, and a 2-time Wooden Award winner. In nearly every category that defines an all-time great, Clark ranks at or near the top. Now, let's compare this to the players ESPN ranked above her. Were they legendary in their own right? Absolutely. But did any of them revolutionize the sport the way Clark did? It's kind of silly when you actually analytically and logically approach it. For a second it falls apart. Because who from those other lists could you put on the Iowa teams and they get the back-to-back championship? Her records stand untouched. Her offensive skill set is unparalleled. And her influence on the game transcends stats. One of ESPN's biggest miscalculations is ignoring the fact that Clark accomplished more with less. Unlike players like Brianna Stewart, Cheryl Miller, and Maya Moore, who were surrounded by stacked rosters filled with All-Americans and future WNBA stars, Clark didn't have the same advantages. Iowa was never a powerhouse program. She didn't inherit a championship-caliber team. She built one. Take Brianna Stewart at UConn, for example. She played alongside multiple elite players, had the benefit of Hall of Fame coaching, and was part of an already dominant dynasty. Winning titles was expected. Now, imagine if Clark had been in that system while Stewart played for Iowa. Would Stewart have dragged that roster to consecutive national championship games the way Clark did? Highly unlikely. The same can be said for Cheryl Miller, who played at USC alongside future Hall of Famers. The Mist, which is Brianna Stewart's team, is the second to worst team in Unrivaled, and Brianna Stewart, with her talent, with her just winning a championship WNBA ring on the Liberty, did not raise that team to any high level in Unrivaled herself. Clark, on the other hand, was the sole reason Iowa even had a shot at competing for a title. Her leadership, vision, and ability to elevate a team turned a mid-tier program into a contender. That type of influence should matter far more than the number of trophies on the shelf. But Clark's greatness isn't just about what she did on the court, it's about how she changed the sport. And that's something ESPN conveniently ignored. Before Clark, women's college basketball wasn't pulling in record-breaking viewership. She changed that. She packed arenas, drove TV ratings to all-time highs, and skyrocketed merchandise sales. No other player in ESPN's rankings had this level of influence on the game. Clark didn't just dominate statistically. She made women's basketball more relevant than ever before. Even ESPN's own analysts admitted her impact was unparalleled. Yet they still erased her from their rankings. And this brings us to the bigger issue, ESPN's clear bias. If Clark were any other player, there's no doubt she'd be treated differently. ESPN has repeatedly pushed narratives that downplay her success while propping up their chosen stars. It's not just about this ranking. It's a pattern of disrespect that's impossible to ignore. Take ESPN's reasoning for excluding Clark. She didn't win a championship. But as we've already pointed out, they have celebrated plenty of all-time greats who never won a college title. Pete Maravich, Oscar Robertson, and Larry Bird all failed to win a championship. Yet ESPN never questioned their place among the greats. But when it comes to Clark, suddenly the rules change. This bias isn't just reflected in rankings. It's in the way ESPN covers Clark compared to other players. They constantly hype up athletes like Angel Reese, Asia Wilson, and South Carolina's dynasty, yet when Clark achieves something historic, they find a way to downplay it. When she set new records, ESPN barely acknowledged them. When she carried Iowa to back-to-back national title games, they shifted the focus to the teams that beat her instead. The double standard is even more blatant when it comes to controversies. When Angel Reese taunted Clark in the national championship game, ESPN rushed to defend her, calling it competitive fire. But when Clark displayed that same energy on the court, suddenly she was labeled as cocky or disrespectful. The inconsistency is undeniable. And it's not just about Reese, it's the way ESPN frames the entire conversation around Clark. When another player succeeds, ESPN spins it as a triumph against adversity. When Clark succeeds, they either ignore it or find a way to discredit it. They've spent more time covering WNBA players who criticize Clark than actually celebrating her accomplishments. They continuously push the idea that she's overrated, despite all the statistical and financial evidence proving otherwise. It's obvious at this point, ESPN has an agenda when it comes to Caitlin Clark, and the more they try to diminish her, the more ridiculous they look. Here's the reality. Caitlin Clark is the biggest superstar women's basketball has ever seen, and ESPN knows it. They are fully aware that she's the reason behind record-breaking attendance figures. They understand that she's the driving force behind women's college basketball's historic TV ratings. They recognize that she's why the WNBA is finally getting mainstream attention. And yet, they refuse to acknowledge her properly because doing so would contradict the narrative they've spent years crafting. ESPN has long positioned certain athletes as the faces of women's basketball, investing heavily in promoting their chosen stars. But Clark's rise has shattered that illusion. She didn't just enter the spotlight, she took it over. Recognizing her for what she truly is would mean admitting that she has surpassed the very players they've spent years hyping up. Rather than accept that, they try to downplay her influence, omit her from historic rankings, and pretend that her impact isn't as game-changing as it really is. But fans aren't fooled. They see what's happening. They see Clark's undeniable impact on the game. They see ESPN twisting narratives to fit their agenda. No matter how hard the network tries to diminish her, the truth is impossible to ignore. Clark has transformed women's basketball in a way no player before her ever has. And that raises the bigger question, if ESPN is willing to manipulate history now, what will it take for them to finally give Clark the respect she deserves? At this point, ESPN can adjust rankings, shift goalposts, and spin the story however they like. But they can't erase reality. Caitlin Clark isn't just a great player, she's one of the greatest to ever step onto the court. Her influence extends beyond statistics. She brought millions of new fans into the sport. She elevated women's basketball to a new level. No media bias or selective rankings can take that away from her. Are you? Let us know in the comments. Like, subscribe, and turn on all notifications so you never miss out. Click the video on the screen, and we will see you in the next one.